good morning again. For those of you who have just joined us in the last minute, my name is Gary Painter. I'm the director of the Homelessness Policy Research Institute, or HPRI as we call it. And it's my pleasure, my really distinct pleasure, to welcome you this morning to the Virtual Symposium, which is focused on international approaches to ending homelessness. As most of you know, but some of you are new to HPRI, HPRI is a network that convenes research and policymakers to help design and coordinate timely, relevant, and actionable research to end homelessness in LA County. We focus our work on three basic activities. One is to conduct and facilitate high-impact research. Second is to gather and translate research based on evidence-based approaches and how they've been transformed into practice, supporting both providers and policymakers. And certainly today's conversation fits quite well there to learn what's working in other places. And thirdly is to convene and engage policymakers, researchers, and people with lived experience, and culturally specific organizations to support that research. So today, as we've had, quarterly, we have a research symposium, which provides an opportunity for people to share cutting edge research, but also a chance for people who are with us to engage, who are in policy making positions or practitioner communities, to dive deeper into a particular topic. And today I'm especially excited because we have an exceptional group of researchers from all over the globe. I'll offer special thanks for those who are joining us in their evening. As you see, we'll have people who are presenting research in the context of Brazil, Continental Europe, the UK, and South Africa. Our program this morning will include 4 brief presentations to get everyone started, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So our first presenter today is Dr. Fabricia de Hora Pereira, and she was going to present her research about homelessness in Brazil. She's worked in analysis and evaluation both for the Public Ministry of the Federal District and Territories and the Domestic Violence Technical Advisory Service. Fabricia, I'm pleased to introduce you to our audience. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy for being here with you all. Thank you, Dr. Gary and team for this event. I'm Fabricia, I'm from Brazil, and I have done research in the area of homelessness in Brazil for more than 10 years. In 2009, the first study that I participated had an objective to understand the relationship between the abuse of alcohol and other drugs and the impact to homeless mental health. Also, in 2009, it was instituted the National Policies for Homeless Population in Brazil. This is an important federal law that establishes homeless rights and the responsibilities of the federal government, states, and counties for the implementation of this law. Brazil is a very large country. Even though we have a federal law, which states and the countries will implement the public policies differently. So I believe that the biggest challenges in Brazil in regard to homelessness are cuts in investments in public policies, unemployment, increasing social inequality, and deepening poverty. For example, since 2016, the federal government implemented a federal law that cut the investments to public policies for the next 20 years. Last year, Brazil became one of the countries with the highest inequality levels. 10% of the population own 42% of the country's income. Between 2012 and 2020, the homeless population grew 140%. Last year, the homeless population was estimated to be 222,000 people in Brazil. Now, in the pandemic, in favelas, 80% of the population eat because of food banks and donation. So in my analysis, I saw that in the next 20 years, poverty and inequality could increase, and a large number of Brazilians will be high candidates to become homeless. So until 2018, I coordinated for 4 years a research program in a university in Brasilia. Brasilia is the capital of Brazil, with an objective to analyze the access homeless women have to health policies and prevention violence policy against them. And after 2019, that is when I saw I necessity to expand my research to include the needed prevention category. Up to 2019, my studies were specific for chronic condition homelessness. But because of the social inequality in Brazil, I saw that I couldn't restrict my studies just to chronic homelessness. I saw that the public policies for chronic homeless had a high cost and couldn't meet their objectives because there were problems in their implementation. So I created a category to analyze public policies for homeless population to prevent homelessness. So this new prevention policy category that I have been working on taking place in Brasilia, capital of Brazil, and the results of my research are used by Ministério Público do Distrito Federal e Territórios, which is an institution of the justice system that has one of the attribution to supervise the implementation of public policies for homeless population. My research also helping the Human Rights Commission in the House of Representatives to create laws for homeless based on scientific studies. I'm convinced, based on my previous experience, we need in Brazil to create more integration between public policies, especially in the area of mental health, employment, shelter, and violence prevention. Because in Brazil, the motives for being on the streets are the first, problems with alcohol and other drugs. Second, unemployment. Third, family problems. Family problems like violence in the family. The category of prevention of homelessness is a proposal that lists main indicators of social inequality, the profile of homeless, and the growth of the risk factors for the emergence of this population to understand which are the most important public policies. It is a method aims to predict and act on risk factors. One of the prevention areas that I am studying is how to improve the quality of the services of the centers for social assistance. These services are for people who have some social risk due to alcohol abuse, domestic violence, poverty, unemployment, and more. If the risk factors don't change, these people can become homeless in the future. To this date, I continue to study how to expand the access of the homeless population to social policies, especially health and social assistance. I'm also expanding the prevention category with a focus on different people with social risk, so that public policies could have a rational cost and be more efficient. Now I'm living here in California, and I'm looking for partnerships to continue the research in this topic. If anyone is interested, please contact me. Once again, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Fabricia, for both introducing the context of Brazil, which I know many people have, engaged in perhaps only through media and so forth, to really understand how that's changed over time. And we will certainly return to questions about, the work that you're doing and what you're learning. Now I'd like to introduce Freek to us. Freek is going to discuss some of the gaps in knowledge and homelessness in continental Europe. He currently serves as the director of the Federation of National Organizations Working with the Homeless, which is a network of organizations who are working to end homelessness in Europe. Freek, please go ahead and tell us a little bit more about your organization and what homelessness looks like in continental Europe.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning, evening from Belgium to all of you. In the 10 minutes that I have, I wanted to say 2 words about Fianza, 2 words about something that is probably quite unique, because as an NGO, we have a research network inside the NGO, which is interesting, which has been useful for Fianza, and then 2 words about the research gaps that we see in continental Europe. Now, as you said, Gary, the Fianza is a European NGO that brings together national, local NGOs working with homeless people. Most of our members are actually shelter providers, emergency shelter or long-term shelter, but we also have social housing providers, etc. So it's more diverse than just the shelter sector. And we have members in almost 30 European countries, including most of the EU member states. So it's quite an effort to bring some sense into that kind of cooperation. Just to overcome the language problem is already a challenge from time to time. We assume that everybody speaks English, but it's actually not always true. Maybe just one thing about, because I often get asked the questions, how many people experience homelessness in the European Union area? And we did an estimate. It's not a scientifically robust estimate, but I think it's still quite close to the truth. We estimate that there is at least 700,000 people in the European Union area that experience homelessness. It is that live on the street, sleep on the street, or in a shelter on any given night in the European Union area. And that's 70% more than 10 years ago, 70% more than 10 years ago. So there is really something happening at the bottom end of society. And something that the Europeans don't like to do very often when it concerns social policy is to compare Europe with the US. And if you look at the number per population in Europe and US, it is actually quite similar, which is a bit of an annoying observation for European policymakers that pride themselves on the social protection model, but I'll come back to that in a minute. We have created Fianza, not me, but my predecessors created Fianza more than 30 years ago. And about 5-6 years after its creation, the organization decided to create a research network inside the NGO. And like I said, it's quite unique because it's the NGO that decides on the research topics. We pay for the research, but we also promise the researchers to publish the research, even if it is not in line with what the NGO would think or would anticipate is the result. And that leads to, I would call it, fruitful tensions between the research community and the NGO community, but it helped also Fianza to become an evidence-based organization. And I think that's what has been one of the elements that created the lifeline for the organization. Homelessness is not considered a huge issue, social issue in Europe, but I think the fact that we presented ourselves at European level as a center of knowledge helped us to make ourselves useful and to sustain our continuation into the future. You could actually say that we have moved from a trade union of the shelter sector into a European knowledge platform, thanks to the research. So the creation of that research observatory, even if it comes with a number of tensions from time to time, less so now than 10 or 20 years ago, it has been extremely useful. And I just wanted to highlight two things that I consider quite successful from the work of the Research Observatory of Fianza. One might seem very obvious and superficial, but it has been really important for us. It's to develop a definition of homelessness. What actually is homelessness? And we try to capture the dynamic nature of homelessness in that definition. And we call that definition the European typology of homelessness and housing exclusion. And it's called ETHOS in short. And to our surprise, that has been not only useful to facilitate transnational cooperation, so at least to make sure that we know what we're talking about, what aspect of homelessness we're talking about, but it has also served a need at national and local level. Apparently, many countries were struggling with definitional issues, and we see many countries using this ETHOS definition as a framework, as a reference definition. A lot of the research that is produced in Europe will start with referring to ETHOS as a reference definition to then say, well, my research is about that aspect. So that has been quite successful. And the other is the actual growing interest on housing first in Europe is actually started by, it's the research community, it's our research observatory that brought housing first to Europe, that went to look in the US what was happening there, and then made an evidence-based claim for doing housing first in Europe as well. And now about the research gaps that I see. It's a personal view, of course, like there is no consensus about where we have to focus research, but on the basis of more than 20 years experience now in the homeless sector, I would like to cite quickly 5 topics that I think are really important from a research point of view. First of all, it is the relation, if possible, causal relation between aspects of the social welfare system and the level of homelessness. There's a lot of assumptions being made about that. Assumptions like the more social housing you have, the less homeless people you have. The more inequality or the lesser the income inequality is, the lesser the level of homelessness will be. Or the more member states spend on social protection, the lower the number of homeless people would be. Well, if I, in a superficial way, would rank countries on the basis of their social welfare performance and then the number of homeless people, the relation seems to be more complicated than that. And sort of to understand that complication is really a challenge for researchers, but would be extremely useful for us for advocacy purposes and policy development purposes. The second area is prevention, and Fabricia mentioned it already. We know actually quite little about prevention in the detail, like what triggers or combination of triggers actually lead to homelessness or almost certainly lead to homelessness. We make a lot of assumptions about prevention, but the evidence is not always there. A third area is more complex, but it is the relation between the time dimension of homelessness and the complexity of homelessness. There is the assumption that chronic homeless people have more complex needs than episodically homeless people or transitional homeless people. Well, I don't think it's so simple. It depends from country to country. We see countries where you see the same complexity of needs, whether you're chronic, transitional, or episodical homeless. And I think it's really important to understand that relation between the time people are homeless and the complexity of their needs, because, for instance, housing first is aimed at people with complex needs, and we use the chronicity as a proxy of complexity. But if basically all homeless people have complex needs, you can do housing first for all of them. So I think that we need to understand a bit better. A fourth area is cost-benefit analysis. We really need to try to come to grips with that and do it in a realistic way. Like I see lots of cost-benefit studies that make claims that are really difficult to use vis-a-vis policymakers. We have to maybe we have to also probably be a little bit more honest about the cost benefit in the short and the long term. So that would be very helpful. And then the fifth area for us, it's a big one, is how do you transition from a shelter-based system? And in Europe, we have a huge shelter system. Like most of the homeless population, unlike in the US, are in shelters. There's a slight minority, a tiny minority that is living on the street. How do you get from such a system to a housing-led or housing-first system in practice? What works? What are the steps to go through? That I think would be quite useful. And the last area, which is a personal interest as well, is to have a better understanding of what is positive outcomes for homeless people. There is a tendency to try to capture successful integration process in a very static, traditional way. And we insufficiently try to integrate the subjective feeling of success of homeless people into that. That would also be extremely useful. And I would like to end, Gary, with a call for us. We struggle to integrate in the research that we fund a diversity of research disciplines. It's no secret that certainly in continental Europe, the homeless research is very dominated by sociologists and social geographers. But we need more economists. We also need more health specialists. It's very interesting to see that most of the research is actually produced by health professionals, health specialists. But it seems to have some kind of a disconnect from the homeless policy and certainly the homeless service provision. I think we have to bring the health dimension into the proper homeless policy. So if you have any tips on how to make the research community a little bit more diverse when researching homelessness, that would be extremely welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Freek. And, I think the number that you led with, 700,000, is striking, and it really does motivate, certainly my own inquiry into what's happening in those different contexts. And the fact that you have such different social support context across the countries is really interesting, and certainly subject for more knowledge and research here. Next, I'm going to turn to the UK and Lesia Teixeira, who is the current Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Homelessness Impact. It's an organization that, as Freek was talking about in the context of Continental Europe, is really working to find evidence-based and sustainable solutions, in this case, in homelessness in the UK. Lesia, let me turn it over to you. We look forward to hearing about what you're doing in the UK.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. I'll just share my screen very quickly. So, who are we? The Centre for Homelessness Impact. We are a new work centre for homelessness in the UK, and we were set up to help address the most important challenge in homelessness in the UK of our time. This one here: how do we end homelessness for good? Because over the years, lots of fantastic work has been done. And despite our collective efforts, homelessness remains a significant issue in many communities across the country. So there's a lot to be proud of, but we wanted to go further. It was felt quite strongly that it was time for a new approach. So in other fields, we've known that it was possible to accelerate impact by adopting new methods. So we wanted to do the same in homelessness. So our mission is simple, is to help accelerate the end of homelessness by focusing on what works and by starting a movement that can lead to more and faster experimentation across the sector. Now, I don't need to tell you that COVID-19 is, of course, making a challenging situation even more difficult. Spending on homelessness was rising even before the pandemic. Just in England, over £3 billion were spent on homelessness, and most of that in emergency services rather than prevention. And that funding, it's well known, can be fragmented, can be very ineffective. And of course, we're all worried about not just the viral impacts of the pandemic, but also the non-viral impacts. Now, what was quite clear to us here in the UK is that government, both at local and national level, and the wider sector so far, has responded to the pandemic at speed. So over 37,000 individuals have already been helped. And in fact, 26,000 people have been moved into settled longer-term accommodation, and over 11,000 are still in self-contained emergency accommodation. So a lot has happened, and very fast, which really shows what's possible if people, have the right energy and put their mind to something. All of these efforts were helped by a raft of emergency measures that were also introduced to protect those who might be at risk. So, for instance, a moratorium on evictions that we're worried might be coming to an end quite soon, though in Scotland it might be extended until later in the year. And also efforts to reduce long-term unsheltered homeless. It was quite clear that in terms of achievements in the last year, they're quite stark, really, because only 16 deaths have been, due to COVID-19 that we know of. Infections in the last lockdown have gone up slightly, but still, a significant achievement. So, bearing all of that in mind, what else needs to happen if we are to make sure that the gains of the last year are maintained, as well as, accelerate impact? Our work and the evidence to date suggests that we need to act on three fronts in particular. First of all, data. Our data is better than in many other countries in Europe and elsewhere, but it's still not as good as it needs to be if we're going to help people in real time. And then we need much better insight into what works, for whom, and where. And in particular, around the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of different interventions. Because otherwise, how can policymakers and practitioners be expected to make better decisions? But finally, we know from other fields that you can have all the best evidence in the world, and unless the conditions are right, that evidence won't land. So it's quite clear to us that unless you are working in parallel to build capacity in local areas, unless you're mobilizing people to create a learning culture, we won't go very far either. So you need action on those three fronts, and for the rest of this short presentation, I'll just tell you a little bit about each one of them in terms of developments in the UK and some of the work that at the Centre we've started putting in place to help with those things. So when it comes to data, similar to the US, really, it's hard to tell how many people exactly are homeless. And certainly the pandemic, on the one hand, highlighted the importance of data, and we've seen a new appetite for data, but it also highlighted that we often lack the data with sufficient breadth and depth to really, help people faster. But the data we have, which is, I suppose, tells us quite a bit about trends, does show that they've been moving, generally speaking, in the right direction. And since 2017, the trends of unsheltered homelessness in the UK have actually been going down quite significantly. It's a different story for other types of homelessness. So the number of applications to councils across the UK, they have statutory duty to help people in need, have either been been stable or declining in some areas, but the levels of households in temporary accommodation, which in the UK they're considered to be homeless, continue to rise in most of the nations. And that's a real concern, because most of the money, the 3 billion I mentioned at the beginning, they're going towards temporary accommodation rather than helping people in other ways. So we're very much hoping to start really looking at what else can be done. But another bit of context that might be useful is a little bit more detail about the legislation. So the UK is different from many other countries in the world, as far as we can tell from research we've been doing on this lately, in that we provide very strong statutory duties that mean people in need of housing that fall in certain priority groups in all nations apart from Scotland, where priority need doesn't even exist. They do have rights to housing, and housing of good quality. We're not talking about shelters, we're talking about long-term housing. It just means that sometimes to achieve it, they need to spend long periods in temporary accommodation. The other thing that I thought people might find interesting, I guess, today is to discuss the fact that our evidence tools that map the best evidence in the English language from across the globe, they really highlight that the US is a source of reliable evidence when it comes to tackling homelessness, much higher quality than in other parts of the globe. But in general, homelessness, is actually a lot worse than in most parts of the UK, if not all, because of the reduced provision of welfare support. So absolutely take some of the things that Freek mentioned earlier, but the analysis we've been doing lately does suggest that that is the case, and that the root causes of the problem are the same in the US as they are in Europe. But other things then obviously get in the mix, which is why we need empirical methods to help us improve success. So just moving on, in terms of looking ahead to the challenges that we are facing in the UK, I thought I'd share them in case useful. So one of the things we're facing, looking ahead to the next year or so beyond, is the fact that the government has a target to end unsheltered homelessness by 2024, and that's absolute zero that we're talking about. It's not functional zero. In fact, if we were to apply the definition of functional zero developed in the US, or the two developed in the US, even in London, we would have ended all types of homelessness, single homelessness. So this is very pertinent that the government have a massive target, but the data is poor. We also don't have insight into what works for whom a lot of the time, and it's really important that we start addressing these key problems. Our shared platform that brings together all the relevant data, and it's open source for everyone to use, hopes to start addressing some of the challenges by helping track developments across communities across the UK. So that's just an example. Another pressing priority, as we see it, that our work suggests needs to be prioritized, is cross-sector collaboration. So, and COVID-19 really highlighted, for instance, the interdependence between housing and health. Obviously, there's already really good examples in the US and the UK of close collaboration across sectors. So Housing First, the whole scaling of Housing First in the US and now more and more in Europe is a really good example of that. But these tends to focus on the most extreme cases. So this is no longer enough. If we're actually going to change something about how we tackle homelessness and drive prevention upstream, that really needs to change. We need more cross-sector collaboration with less complex cases. Another thing that needs to happen is that we need to pay even greater attention to prevention. And the prevention turn in the UK started back in the 90s, and something that is really clear to see is that unless we're able to both zoom in on specific groups, but also take the systems view, it will be hard to improve how we tackle homelessness in the UK. And a cautionary tale I often use at the moment with stakeholders here is from Salt Lake City. And I don't know if anyone from Salt Lake City is watching, but certainly many of you might remember how some years ago, back in early 2000, they invested massively on housing first, and the results were phenomenal. So over a period of 10 years, there's a reduction of over 90% of people who were chronic homeless. And that's obviously a huge success. But obviously what was less talked about was that in that same period that the types of homelessness continued to rise. So important, example, because, that is the danger we face in other countries and certainly in the UK as well. The other thing that's interesting to note is that the interventions that are highlighted as being promising in existing high quality reviews are already quite common across the UK. But what we don't have is information about the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of different prevention measures and what's the right combination for different client groups. So this is where greater use of empirical methods to assess this will make a huge difference. And this is why you'll see the centre doing a series of trials, whether it's in areas like cash transfers or different types of intervention in different contexts, or things like out-of-borrow placements, because we feel that, that's one of the gaps that needs filling. And the other area that is a really interesting development in the UK at the moment is that you have cities and communities actually saying, we want to move away from a shelter system altogether. So currently in the UK, we don't really use shelters for families. That doesn't exist. They're always housed in temporary accommodation of different types. Sometimes they're housed in B&Bs. But local areas want to go even further, and they want to not just to reduce the use of temporary accommodation, but start moving away from shelters that usually in the UK will be of about 30, 40 self-contained units, not massive shelters as you might find elsewhere, to make sure that we're improving outcomes, but also saving money. That, again, that's what the evidence suggests. But what we know is that won't just happen overnight. We need to help people to do that, because sometimes it's really hard to even think creatively about how a certain locality might do this. But we have all sorts of really powerful examples, whether it's from the northeast of England, the whole of Scotland wanting to move towards this new type of system, etc. So a really positive development. But, the final barrier I want to mention that I think is worth highlighting is this. There's a perception challenge, which is really interesting to us. So some polling we did recently shows that even though the UK is doing actually quite well in relation to homelessness, that the public think that the problem is a lot worse than it actually is. So they think that 11% of adults are currently homeless in the UK, when in fact the reality is closer to 0.5%. But the public have a much more accurate perspective on things like poverty and the affordability of housing. So we're quite puzzled by this, and we think it's something to do with the availability of data. It's also to do with sometimes a tendency for us as human beings to emphasize the negative. So we're interested in how do we mobilize people to both introduce greater transparency in the system, but continue to drive for greater improvements, which is why we've launched our End It With Evidence campaign that really calls on people to sign up to free pledges around the strategic challenges that we've identified in the field. So it's very much about mobilizing people to help build the evidence of the programs that work and don't work, then helping to build a capacity that is needed for people to act on evidence promptly, and finally to use evidence-led communications to make sure that we don't use language that's stigmatizing people, and we change the story that we tell about homelessness, and we don't let homelessness be a defining trait in people's lives. But I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ligia. Next, I would like to invite John Hopkins to discuss some cost study work in homelessness in South Africa. By way of introduction, John's the acting director and chief operations officer of U-Turn, which is an NGO working to end homelessness in Cape Town. John, we're very excited that you're able to join us today.
Thank you very much. As you can probably tell, I'm a Brit in South Africa, in Cape Town. And so the cost of homelessness, this is a study that was done with U-Turn, Kalisa and MES, 3 local NGOs. There is very little research in middle-income countries that middle and lower-income countries that we found. And a lot of the research when we were looking was very much based on stuff we found from Europe and also from the US. So homelessness in South Africa, there are approximately 200,000 people experiencing street homelessness, but this is a 2008 figure. There's been no updated figure across South Africa. In Cape Town, there have been a couple of censuses run by the local government in 2015 and 2018. And extrapolating from that, we estimate that there are 14,000 people experiencing street homelessness. By that, in Europe, it might be rough sleeper. It's anyone who's on the street, sleeping outdoors, and it also includes the shelter population. Now, I've seen in the chat, there's some discussion around the difference between the US and Europe. Well, of that 14,000, about 2.5 is within the shelter, and the remaining is actually on the street. So homelessness is a very visible problem when you walk around the streets of Cape Town. What are the main causes? This isn't the Bible on this, but it's something that we've tried to figure out and understand, certainly from a Cape Town perspective. And we contend that when 2 things combine, it leads to homelessness. And these 2 things are in the middle of this diagram. If you're unable to earn an income, now the unemployment rate is about 30% in South Africa, so it's very high. But there's a lot of people who are not homeless. But when you've broken your social support network, so you've broken your relationships with family, you have all your friends, or you have no savings, there isn't a very good social safety net here, that's when you land up on the street. What leads to you breaking your your support network, or meaning you're unable to earn an income? Well, it's often substance addiction, substance use disorders, which are very high among the homeless population in Cape Town. Pathological issues around poor health, disability, mental health issues. And then also kind of psychological development issues around poor self-esteem or poor emotional control, quick like anger management issues that you just get kicked out of home and resorting to violence, etc. Tied into that are broken society, broken family, the high gang, a lot of gangs, a lot of poverty, a lot of inequality. So all kind of ties into this. So the purpose of the costing study, and this was, as we can see, the first one done in Africa, and certainly the first one done in South Africa, it was trying to understand more acutely what was spent on homelessness annually in Cape Town to enable all role players from different sectors to actually say, are we doing the right things? And are we actually, is the cost of doing nothing, which there's not a lot that's happening, is there no cost to that, which is the often assumption among policymakers? It was also to illuminate some of the realities experienced by those on the streets, and then to guide planning and support policy development. So we reviewed existing costing studies. We included only clearly definable costs. We didn't include any multiplier costs. We didn't include any sort of cost to tourism, which is a major source of income for Cape Town. We didn't look at, we looked at only the things that we could say, right, we actually have something in somebody's budget or an account here. The majority of figures were 2019 or budgeted 2020. The research was actually collected January through March last year, so before the COVID lockdown hit. So it doesn't show the impact of COVID, which has increased costs. And there are a number of sources, including a study of 350 homeless people that we did with a local research institution. We categorized all the costs into 3 categories. Humanitarian, this is the compassionate cash handouts that is support for members of the public. It's the reactive or punitive costs, which is either the cost of urban management cleaning up after people, and the lack of ablution facilities is certainly something that the streets are cleaned every morning before people wake up and businesses open. And there's also the criminal justice costs, which, like a lot of countries, were one of the biggest drivers. And then developmental costs, we said, okay, let's have a very broad definition of developmental. Let's say anything that's actually to support a homeless person to stay alive, whether it's providing meals, whether it's shelter, or anything, and then the more kind of developmental programs that are actually helping people to leave the streets long term. Healthcare is not included. That's a big gap. We couldn't find reliable costs on that. That's hopefully something we can add in time. There are also a number of other things, smaller organizations, private security, economic costs, government grants to individuals, a number of things that were not included in this. So this is absolutely a minimum cost. So one of the first finding I want to share is the average time on the street was 8 years and 7 months. The median, 4 years, 7 months, mean was 8 years, 7 months. And it ranged from 4 days to 44 years. But it's generally a very, people be on the street a long time in Cape Town. Tied into that is its high levels of chronic homelessness. Now, on the definition taken from the US on chronic homelessness, at least 50% of the Cape Town population qualified under that definition. In the US, we found that it was 25%. In Northern Ireland, they said it was between 5 and 10%. So Cape Town there are very, very high levels of chronic homelessness. And we were also finding that the longer someone's on the street, the more it does cost in terms of there's a lot of deterioration in mental and physical health. And these become more complex and harder to resolve. Now, I know Freek was challenging us on, is that always the case? No, it's absolutely not. But in terms of the conversations with people who've been on the street less than a year, often due to the reasons, it's easier than someone who's had their hope dashed 5 times and the shelter system's failed them, where you can only stay for 3 months. So it's much harder to work with people who've been on the street longer, is our experience. So the overall cost, now in dollar terms, this sounds very small, 53 million. But in Rand value, that is actually very high. 744 million is spent a year on homelessness in Cape Town. But most interesting was the way the costs were broken down. 39% is on compassionate handouts. This is people giving money to people who are living on the street and saying, go and buy yourself a meal, go and get into a shelter. It's often used for other things as well. The reactive punitive costs, because it's in Cape Town mainly kind of a criminal justice-led response, fining people who are homeless for breaking bylaws, very high levels of arrest. And that was 45% of the cost. And then developmental was just 16%. And kind of ties in with, okay, you can see how a lot of people, that's why people on the street, once you land up on the street, the chances and the exit points from the street are, certainly from state and non-profit organizations, are very, very small. Per person, 51,000 Rand a year, $3,700, 4,300 per month. The minimum wage here is 3,500 Rand or 3,700 Rand. So the minimum rate, that's about minimum wage is what it's costing per month, just as a comparison, if you try and put that in dollar terms. So to put it in context, it's a costing study. It doesn't say the savings that would accrue so we can move from the different categories. Some spending can be saved and some spending could be redirected. For example, spending on cleaning the streets every morning. Like if you have better ablution facilities, you wouldn't be cleaning up people's excrement. There'd be less of that around. It doesn't measure cost effectiveness. It focuses on total costs and cost per person, but that's our hopeful next step. This is the minimum cost, as I mentioned before. It's conservative in all calculations because we wanted to get the ball rolling, not have the study kicked out and just dismissed because it included some nice assumptions, but actually we're not direct costs. And it doesn't apportion blame. Often it's you look to government and say, why aren't you doing more? But this is a society in Cape Town. This is what it's costing us. So what does this mean from a policy perspective? Well, it means that the current response is expensive. And each person facing homelessness is costing society at least 445,000 Rand, that's $31,000 while they're on the streets. Now, when we ask the people, how long have you been on the streets? If we ask them again, that average has probably gone up. The numbers have definitely increased post-COVID, and certainly people haven't, we're seeing the numbers growing and people aren't leaving the streets. A security-based response doesn't help. If you look at the end game, it's like, okay, so what are we doing? Are we helping people to actually leave the streets, or are we helping to criminalize the population? We need longer-term solutions, providing sustained pathways off the street. And for example, effective programs from nonprofits with a very small scale, they cost approximately $10,000 per individual over 2 years that have very high success rates. Compare that to 31,700 and you can see, okay, you're starting to sort of see there are other options. But it's interesting how the policymakers go, yeah, but no, these programs are very expensive. We're hoping to try and change that narrative. And then there's a lot we can learn from international research and best practice. So acting quickly, certainly in some cases in Cape Town can lower complexity and thus cost. Criminalizing people is detrimental and makes it even harder. And affordable housing provision. So we're not even on housing first. We also, out of that 14,000 people, there's over 1 million people estimated in Cape Town in substandard housing, shacks, in informal settlements. And it's not even touching that side of things. This is the visible street homelessness. But so affordable housing is definitely part of a critical element as a long-term solution. Lots of people involved in this study. I'm not going to go through that. But if you want to find the report, it's available from this following URL. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, John. And also thank you to the audience for being so active in the chat and in the Q&A, and for panelists who are actively answering questions and answers already. Because there are so many answers already there, I'm going to go ahead and take a moderator's prerogative and try to summarize where I think maybe we can just provide some clarity for folks, again, in terms of the context and differences across places. The last question, actually, Lucy Dale asked about terminology. Are there discussions in Brazil, UK, Cape Town, EU, etc., to talk about how people who are, homeless referred to? In the US context, as is sort of noted in the question, there's been a push to change from the term homelessness, or even experiencing homelessness, to unhoused, or kind of making the distinction around unsheltered. And I'd like to kind of add an addendum to this question, or maybe each person could answer, and just again remind us, what's the most typical form of homelessness is being experienced? Is it literally on the streets? Is it in shelters? Is it in a different context? So kind of two questions again: what's the terminology that's often used in the country that you're doing work, and is there change in that over time? And the second one is just to remind us, what is the dominant form of homelessness? Fabricia, could you get us started in sharing from Brazil?
Okay, first, in Brazil, we have a federal law. So the concept about homeless stay there is a big concept. For example, in Brazil, homelessness is people, for example, people don't have house, but if the person stay in the street, for example, and tonight come back for home, these people is homelessness in Brazil. The poverty is a key for understand the homeless in Brazil. Poverty and social inequality. It's a little bit different because I can see in different countries the concept, the homeless is more it's a focus on the people don't have a house. In Brazil too, but in Brazil it's more because, for example, we have so many inequality. No, so I need to understand the homelessness specific and different countries. I think I agree, this concept in Brazil, it's better because the social inequality. And the major people in Brazil, the homelessness are men and Black men. And the research show people stay in the street because abuse of alcohol and other drugs, and the conflict and the family. Problem is family. So it is important to understand why it's the motive. Mm-hmm. It's important because I saw in Brazil the public policies for chronic homelessness had a high cost, and they can't change the reality because you moved only a little bit person. And after, you have more and more and more and more. So I think in Brazil, you need to think answers together to prevent and chronic homelessness.
Thank you, Fabricia. Freek, the definition of homelessness, I could imagine across Europe is quite diverse in the different countries that you're working with. What are some of those differences that you see, and have there been changes in how people talk about those who are living on the streets or in shelters?
Yes, maybe let me first say that native English people sometimes underestimate the power of the word homelessness. It's untranslatable in most languages in the European Union. The fact that homelessness is actually integrating in one and the same concept, the concept of a house and the concept of feeling at home. That's a very powerful concept. In most languages, you're houseless, but the element at home is not there. So you see more and more countries actually using the word homeless because they cannot capture that kind of reality with the words that they have. Like I see more and more in Italy, for instance, in Italian text, the word homeless because it works. So that's the first thing. And I think in general, there is a tendency to broaden the homeless concept. Probably 20, 30 years ago, there was a stronger focus on literal homeless, like you call it, street homelessness, etc. Now there is more and more countries that are also trying to capture not only the sheltered population, but the invisible homeless population. The sofa surfers in some countries are actually part of the formal definition of homelessness. So I think in general, you could say it changes towards a slightly larger definition of homelessness. Also to capture the dynamics, like people move from one category in the other without actually moving to a sustainable solution. You were asking also the question that what's the typical, what's the typical profile? I think we have to say that also in Europe, it's mostly single man still, and probably single men of middle age or getting older as well. But we see growing number of young people, women homelessness becomes more visible, etc. So it's changing, but the predominant profile is still the middle-aged to older men, I think. And the big difference is, and I can only repeat what I said earlier on, is that in Europe, even if I'm sorry that I overestimated the percentage of people unsheltered in the US, I said it's close to 50%, but apparently it's considerably less. But in Europe, in most countries, it's tiny numbers that are on the streets compared to the people that are in shelter or invisible homeless sofa surfing.
Thank you, Freek. I know that, Ligia, when I first talked to a colleague about homelessness in the UK, they used the term rough sleeper, and I was taken aback. But I'm curious how, terminology definitions of homelessness kind of, and you noted that perception issue. How does that sink into the public consciousness?
Really good question. So in terms of the types of homelessness, how we describe them in UK, we often talk about street homelessness or rough sleeping being the tip of the iceberg. So under the iceberg, you essentially have statutory homelessness, and that's where we have the best data. So families and singles would come under that. And then you have the hidden homeless population, which is even bigger than the statutory homelessness. And at the bottom of the iceberg, we'd have people at risk of homelessness. So we often use the image of the iceberg to describe it. But in terms of language, those categories, we're broadly happy with them. The problem starts when people don't put the people in front of homelessness, in front of statutory homeless, in front of hidden homeless. And they use the condition of being homeless as you know, not as an adjective. And that's problematic. And that's something that we're working to change. So early on in our life, we started compiling a list of terms and ways of describing people that we find are really problematic. And at the moment, there isn't much evidence of whether that's true or not, you know, to what extent they're stigmatizing. So calling someone a rough sleeper, saying that someone has a chaotic life, calling someone a complex needs case or having a chaotic life. Frankly, all of us have complex lives. So is it really helpful? I've never met anyone with experiences of homelessness who likes to be described in that way. So it's an issue in terms of media portrayals, but it's also an issue when it comes to services engaging properly with people who need to use those services. So one of the things we're doing is to now use big data to validate whether some words are indeed stigmatizing. So we should have some results to share soon, but we will be, for the first time, we'll be able to prove which words are stigmatizing and really hopefully then track that data over time, to what extent it's being used. Because at the moment in the UK, people are not anti the agenda of changing language, but change has been very slow. So what we're trying to do is put some tools in place that will really help highlight whether change is happening or not. And then do simpler things like, you know, an image bank that people can access, so they can access images that are not stigmatizing, again, you know, something that's very common, as well as a style guide that hopefully will make it easier for people to use the correct language as well. So that's, you know, what's happening here.
John, you mentioned a few of these issue in your presentation already, but maybe just to kind of put a pin in it, what are the most common ways that people who are experiencing homelessness are referred to in South Africa, and how might that have changed over time?
In terminology, we're still fighting people who talk about vagrants. And so actually we had to write to the local newspaper recently and kind of underwent to saying, and also the homeless, we're saying these are people experiencing or facing homelessness. We're just trying to even create a more inclusive language. It's interesting that the municipality talks about street people, and they're not being derogatory. They're saying that if they talk about homelessness, they recognize that people who live in dwellings which are not fit for human habitation really is a very large number. So they're more looking at sort of that. Interesting. So in terms of unhoused versus sheltered, it's over 80% of in terms of that definition are unsheltered. They're living on the street, and 20% are in shelters. So in Cape Town, you've got it's just a very visible, and it's not just Cape Town. You see it actually in a lot of South African cities.
Thanks, John. So I have a question that is inspired by one of ours in the Q&A, which was talking a little bit about, you know, how if an offer is made or someone is being asked to move from where they are to perhaps a shelter or to move to another place, you know, how does that happen? How successful is it, and so forth? And, you know, related to that, and I think I heard both John and Fabricia note a connection to kind of the local police or the criminal justice system, either by construction or who's responsible for people. And I'm curious, maybe we could begin there and then talk more broadly about issues around outreach. But maybe John and Fabricia, can you share a little bit about whether, you know, how you think it matters that in South Africa and Brazil, there's that direct connection to, an agency or kind of responsibility with respect to public safety officers?
Okay, in Brazil, reviews my experience. For example, shelter policies in Brazil doesn't change this reality. For example, in Brazil, homes given by the government, okay, but people go back to the street. Shelter in Brazil or house, it is insufficient. It is insufficient for Brazil reality because of Brazil. When one person have a house and this person is chronic homelessness, people go back to the street because we can find mental health problems, we can find abuse of alcohol and other drugs, conflict in the family. So I think it's necessary connecting the point about the different topics, the homelessness in Brazil. Only shelter, only, for example, mental health, it is insufficient in Brazil.
Okay.
I believe.
Thank you, Fabricia. John, you noted the role of public safety officers, police. I'm not sure what the right term in Cape Town is. Can you say a little more about that?
Yes, you get private security, you get the municipal police, the public safety officers, and then you get the sort of national police force. So a standard response is someone will phone up and complain about the people experiencing homelessness in their neighborhood. A social worker or someone will go and engage with them. If they don't if they don't want to move into a shelter, and this is kind of tying into the question that was asked in the chat, then a public safety officer will come and will issue them with a fine. Then, and if they put up some sort of structure, be it a tent, be it just something that they found, that will be broken down and they'll be asked to move on into a different neighborhood, making it someone else's problem. And so you've got this kind of approach where people are moving around different parts of the city and they're not moving off the street. Yet you go and talk to someone who's experiencing homelessness. And as part of the study, we said, so why are you on the street? What are your reasons? And 3% of the sample said we choose to be. A lot of the others said it was either because of abuse or family situations or lack of employment, or it was my drug use, or there were lots of different reasons given. And then we asked, so would you like help to leave the streets? And a lot of people said yes, and hardly anyone said no. But a lot of people said, but don't put me in one of those shelters for 3 months. Last time I was raped there, some of the women say, well, the men's like, no, I don't want to go there. Don't make me sweat it out on my heroin addiction, my opioid addiction. Actually, like what I want methadone replacement. And actually, could you find some sort of transitional housing? Or could you find some sort of other way? And so it's looking at alternative approaches rather than this sort of simple, find out, okay, shelter or fine. And that's the standard government response. And so the non-profit response is actually trying to understand people, work with people, and then walk a journey with people, because we found very few people, it's choice, it's often other life circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. And so maybe we can transition a little bit to outreach strategies. We published a review of the literature on outreach strategies here in the US, and it's available on the HPRI website. Curious about kind of the best practices in the UK and in continental Europe as it relates to outreach and connection to people who may be currently living on the streets unsheltered. Ligia, do you want to begin and then Freek?
With pleasure. So one of the types of outreach that seems to have delivered best results in the UK is what is called assertive outreach. So it's not as clearly defined as we would like it to be. And I think there's lots of potential to really test different ways of doing different types of assertive outreach. But the principle is that rather than taking a very passive approach, that you have much more active discussions with people if it seems as if they are resisting offers of support. And in fact, of late, there's been lots of discussions about, are they really resistant, or is it about the services, keeping, trying new ways of actually engaging? Is it more about looking, reframing how outreach is actually done? But that seems to be delivering, successful results, and it usually involves an offer of a certain type. And that's usually discussed closely with people. And if after a number of attempts, the offer is still refused, and this is where it gets controversial, the support might be withdrawn. It doesn't mean that if the person then moved to a neighboring borough, that the same process wouldn't start again. But that's the principle, and it's been popular since the Rough Sleepers Initiative back in the 80s, and it delivered very good results, as some of you may know. In Scotland and other nations, there's definitely a lot more reluctance to using more assertive ways of outreach. But more generally, there seems to be a transition to people thinking that it's really important to put more ownership on the quality of the offer and the type of engagement and what people are trying, rather than expecting the people who might have been on the streets for many years, because usually it would apply to people who are in the streets for very long periods of time, expecting them to change. The other thing that's useful to note in relation to the UK is that most people arriving on the streets, this is something that we identified through our analysis, of late, most of them don't have many support needs, if any. So what do we do with that population when all the response systems at the moment are geared towards the chronic end? Mm-hmm. So one of the things we'd like to scope and see and trial are outreach interventions for people who might be harder to spot and don't fill your stereotypical image of someone who actually is street homeless.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ligia. Freek?
Yes, I'm not going to repeat what Ligia said, but I think one of the elements that is certainly helping to reach to an unreached population now is harm reduction services, the scaling of harm reduction services. It's quite interesting actually to see that the COVID crisis helped with that, like to overcome some of the resistance. In Portugal, for instance, the native country of Ligia, there have been 3 or 4 new shelters been opened in Lisbon to reach out to the rough sleepers population, and harm reduction was introduced as a matter of course. There was no choice, because otherwise these people could not be brought in. So my hope is that the sort of interest in promoting harm reduction services will survive the corona crisis, and that will help to reach a population that was not properly helped before. And sometimes, even if I agree that shelter is not the solution to homelessness, you have to move people into housing, and Housing First has actually shown that you can reach people with very complex needs, that system's work. But some of the solutions in the shelter system are also so easy to reach out to people that don't want to use it. Like, we give you 2 examples. We always think that if you're a rough sleeper, you're a single person. Like, it's almost unthinkable that you're a couple, for instance. So why not have some shelter places for couples? You all know the issue of dogs. Like, some street homeless people have pets, like many shelters don't accept pets. Like how difficult is it to organize that? The whole issue of wet shelters, there is too few wet shelters where people can continue to consume. So like, even if I don't plead for more shelters, I think there is some easy wins, some easy solutions to reach out to a population that would otherwise choose to be on the street. And maybe just one to just stimulate, provoke a little bit of thinking. We have to try to adapt to what people want and what people are realistically able to achieve. Mm-hmm. And there is a very controversial program in Denmark, which is called, they have chosen it to translate it into English in a terrible English. They call it Freek Housing for Freak People. And it's about, that's why I don't want to be called Freek, but Freek, because, but it's a small population of a few hundred people who have failed and failed again and failed again everything that was proposed to them. And these people are given unconditional housing in some kind of small ghettos. It's only for single people, only for adults, and basically they don't have to integrate in society anymore. They can live the life that they want to live. And it's very controversial to sort of publicly say we give up on people. But the results of this scheme, and I encourage you to look into the evaluations that have been done, are very successful. The only thing is that you don't want to offer that to the entire homeless population. You want to offer that to a population that can be clearly identified. It should not be offered as a cheap solution for homeless people that need another solution. But for a very well-targeted population that fails the current offer, it can work. So voilà, that's what I.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Freek. One of the questions in the chat that no one has quite touched on yet that I thought I would surface is kind of the experience of children who may be not necessarily on the tip of the iceberg, to use Liege's analogy, but living in families where it's very, very unstable housing. They may or may not be living in shelters, but they may be moving from place to place to place to place. Is there any policy in place in the countries that you're working in that attempts to identify housing instability in the school systems?
I'm happy to go first. So in the UK, the provision for families is very good and very strong, and certainly any household with a child would be considered in priority need and be owed, settled accommodation. The challenge we have, though, is twofold. Those that do engage with the statutory system and become statutory homeless, or the council helps rehouse, they can still get stuck in poor quality temporary accommodation. That sometimes is very expensive. And imagine large families stuck in a pokey little flat or in a B&B for far too many weeks and not quite knowing where they'll end up, and having to obviously at the moment also work, do their schoolwork from those environments. So it's something that we're very worried about. So yes, it might be better than in other countries, but it's a real concern what's happening to this generation of young kids, and it's something that we're looking into at the moment. But just to add that in Scotland, the protections are extra, and they are actively passing legislation to reduce the amount of time that families are allowed to stay in temporary accommodation. So they're really trying to push something through the legislation to do something about this.
On that point, is there any, are families in need identified within the schools, or are they typically identified through other pieces of the social safety net?
So the key agency here through which anyone whose homelessness is identified is local authorities across the country. Okay. So not the school system. In fact, it's one of the things that we're very interested in doing something about, that the schools are not doing enough to identify families at risk, because that's the other thing I was going to say, that you have the people who are actually going to their local authority for housing needs, but imagine the many other people who are in hidden homeless situations with children who are in really overcrowded conditions, so doubling up, and they definitely tend to be disproportionately from ethnic minorities as well. So it's a real issue.
Okay, great. Yeah, other countries and your approach to engaging and identifying children in at-risk situations? Anything to point out?
In many European countries, the child welfare system is very developed, and when a family becomes homeless, the child welfare system kicks in. But it's the same, like what Lydia described for the UK is the same in many other countries, that the alternative might not label the people as homeless, but their living situation might actually amount to exactly the same experience. So something needs to be done. And housing solutions are probably the most effective for these populations. They often have mainly housing problems. Of course, if you keep them too long in a very precarious situations, they might develop all kinds of other problems, and especially their children. But the situation described in the UK is quite similar in all the European countries.
In Cape Town, in South Africa, I'm not completely au fait with the different legislation. It's not great in terms of identifying people in difficult situations, and the usual approach is to actually remove the child from the family and put them in a children's home, which is not helpful in terms of families. And if you have families on the streets, you'll also land up with the child very quickly actually being taken off the street and offered shelter, but the parents not. And then actually even shelters providing accommodation for families or even couples is not there. So it's something that is sorely lacking, I'm afraid, in this country.
In Brazil, we have a federal law for children, and for them to stay in the family, there is funding for school, food, and health. Families are identified in the social assistance centers. But now, with the pandemic, we are seeing more children in the street. Now it's so hard, the situation in Brazil, especially because of the pandemic. I can see so many children in the streets. It's a hard situation.
That's really heartbreaking. And we have a little time left. There was a lot of questions in the chat, and we can follow up with those. I wondered if each person might reflect either what you see as the biggest challenge to address in reaching your goal of ending homelessness right now. I wonder if we could just do that. I mean, it's hard to say the biggest because there's so many, and maybe the pandemic is the most obvious answer. But you know, what John, I don't know if you would be willing to start. What do you see as perhaps the biggest challenge in Cape Town right now?
Money is scarce. So in terms of, this isn't going to be publicly funded because there are massive other needs. And I just saw the question on social housing. And it's like, they're trying to build houses quickly, but those are the people in checks that are moving to those. So money is scarce and it's changing mindsets. So I guess one thing is, how do we fund this? And the other is, how do we persuade people that a security-based response is not the right way forwards and is actually ineffective, but we need to start proceeding with scaling up and there are some very successful programs, but they're too small in Cape Town for actually providing the support to help people to leave the streets. That needs a partnership with local government, with business, with the community, and then with the nonprofit sector.
Thanks, John. Ligia, what do you see as the most pressing issue in the UK right now?
So the most pressing issues are, some of the things I talked about, but in particular, how do we ensure that we keep up momentum? There's been so much fantastic work done in the last year, but our concern is that the change won't be long lasting. So it will be the past repeating itself again. In the past, we've done massive progress on things like street homelessness, but quickly the gains, everything goes back to the beginning. So we're trying to help break that cycle, but for that to happen, unless we try to improve things today, as well as change things for the longer term around funding structures, data infrastructure, pushing more empirical methods as a way of improving decision-making and mobilizing people precisely. So there's more of a learning culture, we won't be able to rise to the challenge. So we're keeping optimistic, because at the moment it feels as if, provided you come with solutions and ideas, it definitely feels as if you're pushing at an open door. But there's a huge amount of work to be done.
Yeah. Freek? I mean, again, it's hard when you're representing all of Europe, but maybe pick one country.
But I agree with what has been said. I think maybe to just add something is, like, there is a lot of evidence about what works. Like, we see a lot of interest in housing first in Europe, for instance, and we see some countries that are actually putting a lot of energy in scaling housing first. The problem often is that they do that, and at the same time, they're confronted with increasing number of homeless people because the prevention is not effective. And it's extremely difficult to continue the political momentum towards solutions if it doesn't translate into reduction of homeless people. And how to overcome that's, I think, one of the big challenges.
That's certainly very relevant here in Los Angeles as well. Fabricia, what do you see as the biggest challenge, maybe in addition to the pandemic?
In Brazil, to create more integration between public policies, especially in the area of mental health, employment, shelter, and violence prevention. And I think we need to think more how to expand the access of the homeless population to social policies and prevention. Prevention is one way in Brazil indispensable to change this reality.
Thank you, Fabricia. And I think we're at the end of our time, which, if all of you were here at 9 o'clock in the morning beginning, then I might ask you to stay for another half hour because there is so many questions. But I know that at least for 3 of our panelists, you're rapidly approaching the end of your day, dinner time and family time. So I really do appreciate your time with us. I think what this has shown is that there's a lot to learn from both different approaches in different countries, but also different context. But at the same time, there's a lot of similarities in terms of what some of the challenges that people are going through that leads them to living for a short time or a long time on the streets. And I've learned a lot today. Again, I thank everyone for being with us and look forward to following up with all of you as you continue your work. And I hope that you also continue to follow up with the work that we're doing here in LA. So at this point, let me just say goodbye for now.